Okay there, A-pushers. We're going to finish up our period 4 material with a couple days on antebellum revivalism reform. Some kind of things that go on in this antebellum period, try and, I would say, fix, maybe change society for the better. And the whole thing begins with something called the Second Great Awakening. Remember, our first Great Awakening was this period of spiritual revival, kind of the idea of a spiritual reform coming from within people. You have the revivals of great, powerful speakers and church leaders and stuff, kind of having people challenge the religious status quo of the time back in the 1700s. Well, the same thing happens again now in the 1820s and 30s. And so we have a new series of ministers that are leading revivals and new churches being developed, and it's going to lead to some bigger ideas. This new religious reform is going to lead to new ideas of things like temperance, which is going to be getting rid of alcohol, asylum and penal reform, which is going to be fixing the prison system, abolition, to get rid of slavery, women's rights, and changes in the education areas as well. Bless me. All right, so here's a quote. And this is Alexis de Tocqueville. Now, his name is going to come up off and on during this early time period. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French guy who came to the United States with the purpose of touring around the country and wrote a book about for France. So he writes, in France, I'd almost seen the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom pursuing courses diametrically opposed to each other. So the idea that in France we saw religion and freedom were two totally separate things because the Catholic Church in France was always associated with government. But in America, I found they're intimately united, and they reigned in common over the same country. Religion was the foremost of the political institutions of the United States. So at this time in history, religion was a huge deal. And a lot of times the reform and the movements to kind of change things in this country were definitely tied to religion. And it's Alexis de Tocqueville toured all of the United States, including modern-day Wisconsin, as part of his tours. So we're going to try the idea of pursuit of perfection. It's something called Christian perfection, we're going to call it. So we call it Benevolent Empire. So you kind of see where his revivals went. We'll talk about the Burned Over District, this area up here in northern New York, in a second. But these are kind of where all the different revivals took place from city to city. And they kind of get out here as far as Mississippi River into Iowa. And notice they kind of follow the railroads here. So as the railroads are expanding out west, the revivals follow as well. And there were a few in Wisconsin. I've never actually seen where they were. But you kind of see where they go in this 20-year period. Now, the Burned Over District in northern New York was kind of where a lot of this stuff started. And you got a lot of different churches and stuff that develop here in this area. And so you kind of see different cities like Utica, Seneca Falls, Waterloo, and Rochester, where you see a lot of anti-slavery churches and revival churches that develop here, and Mormons and that kind of stuff. All these different areas up here that kind of are these different reforming churches of the time. So here's an example of revival. So like we saw back in the day, you see a few things go along with revivals. You have men and women worshiping together. Women were allowed to pray out loud, which is something that's pretty new, actually. They could do that. They had something called the seat of anxiety or anxiety seat. So if you were kind of questioning your religion, you'd come and sit in that chair up front and people would kind of pray through that kind of stuff. There's interesting kind of revivals that happened here. And there were some dynamic speakers, again, that were part of this. And one of the biggest ones was Charles G. Finney, who talked a lot about I had kind of, we saw before, we had, the ideas of, of dynamic sermons being used to kind of get people to repent their sins, kind of have this Christian perfectionism that they called it, the idea that they're kind of trying to get rid of their sins and be perfect in the eyes of God. And so talk a lot about, kind of these encampments they had, right, of people moving to and fro, praying and singing and shouting. Very different from the traditional services that were there. And they almost called it a soul-shaking conversion, as people were converted in these revivals here. Another church developing in this time, too, is the Mormons. Joseph Smith, first out in New York, and that's where Joseph Smith finds his golden tablets, uses a hat to read them, and then writes what's called the Book of Mormon, which is the version of the religious ideas used for the Mormons. And so if you watch South Park or the Book of Mormon, the play, they make fun of us a little bit, but the idea this was a different version of Christianity told to Joseph Smith via an angel, and then he kind of creates this community of followers that are based off his interpretation of all his Christianity, that people were a little different than others, the current view of it. And so eventually they're kind of a different kind of group, and they weren't necessarily very popular. One one of the things that they practiced was polygamy, which was a man having more than one wife, which was not necessarily seen as very good amongst most of the people. Smith eventually was murdered in Carthage, Illinois, before his followers end up moving out west. And so we get to a lot of violence with Mormons in terms of not agreeing with what they believe and kind of trying to keep their society separate. Some people are not big fans of these guys. So the Mormons, they start up here in New York, and eventually move out west here to Illinois. Illinois is where Joseph Smith is murdered. And then they will eventually go out here to Salt Lake City and kind of make their own little Mormon community out here in 1847. Before this is technically part of the United States, it was still technically part of Mexico at that point. And so Salt Lake, at the Great Salt Lake, so it is now Salt Lake City, Utah. That's why you hear Brigham Young University, because the guy who led them out there was this guy here, Brigham Young, and he kind of creates this Mormon community out in the desert. At Salt Lake City, Utah, where the Mormons could practice and do their own thing and not be bugged by anybody else, and vice versa. They were kind of a little xenophobic. They didn't like outsiders coming in, and so they actually got a lot of conflicts with travelers, Native Americans and stuff who tried to move into their area. And there was some very violent interactions they had with people out in this area as well. Another group is called the Shakers. Okay, and so the Shakers were a special group developed by Mother Ann Lee, who's another offshoot of Christianity. And the Shakers' idea was to live a communal lifestyle with these, just at the time, be raucous types of church services. They're kind of like Quakers with a lot more energy. So I talk a lot about taking out fellow crosses and the God and regeneration. God cleanse you all righteousness. Talk about trouble, people help each other out, and improve one talent. So this is what a Shaker meeting looked like, and you notice there's a lot of dancing involved, and it's kind of a creepy little picture here. But you kind of see they kind of accepted everybody. There was singing, there was dancing. Men and women would worship together, but on separate sides here. And one of the biggest rules of this group is that people were celibate. If you are a member of this religion, you did not have sex. And so the only way they actually gained people in their religion was to have people convert to it later on. They also believed in communal living, and they would live very simply, communally, working together, both men and women, in equal ways. And Shaker community was very popular out in New York, and some other areas as well. There were many Shaker communities to start early on. The last Shaker community dying out around 1920, mostly died out because they were celibate and they couldn't get people to convert to religion anymore. And so they talk a lot about living a very simple life. So it's his gift to be simple, the gift to be free is where it kind of comes down. And you see from one of his hymns here, when true simplicity is gained, to bound then we shan't be ashamed. Turn to our delight, be turning to come around right. The idea that if you live simply and work together, those kind of ideas, you're going to have a much happier life than trying to find money and power, all that kind of stuff. You can kind of see, here's some examples of a Shaker community. It's very simple stuff they used. And they weren't worried about, trying to find a mate, those kind of things as part of their life. So this is what the religious movements that happened this time. Remember, guys, the Second Great Revival, Finney, you have the Mormons, you have the Shakers. You have transcendentalism, so liberation from so this is the idea of called liberation from understanding, cultivation of reasoning. It's kind of European romanticism. We're trying to transcend, if you will, limits of intellect, and kind of go outside of limits of the intellect, the soul, and try to reconnect people with the universe, their reasoning. They call it European romanticism as well. You kind of get this emotional feeling about things. You connect back to nature and kind of create this, universe within your soul, and connect to the original things that are out there. So this is the whole idea about moral truths. We're intuitive, and you need to kind of follow your moral center more than anything, and you need to transcend kind of the earthly ideas and earthly desires that are out here. So the big beliefs were the benevolence of God, that God is kind of all powerful, nature's all powerful, and that man has divinity in man. This idea you kind of aspire to kind of be more than what you are. And so as part of this, they rejected all secular authority, including some case authority in the United States, organized churches, and try to focus more on that personal transcendence outside of what the current beliefs were. If man was truly defined, it would be wicked if they had slavery. So it was a very anti-slavery group, because they felt that people who are truly divine wouldn't be participating in slavery. They wouldn't be clouded by ignorance, that kind of stuff. And the role of reformer was to restore man and God together. So to try to make people all together more holy by doing things like being anti-slavery and inequality and those kind of things. So we see two big people here in the transcendentalists, intellectual writers. See Ralph Waldo Emerson and Harry David Thoreau both wrote a lot of books. So one big focus was on nature. So for Emerson, he wrote a book about nature and kind of how people need to commune nature and get back to nature, those kind of things. Self-reliance was how people need to rely upon themselves and not upon government or other things to get ahead in life. Thoreau wrote Walden. This is when he supposedly sat out on Walden Pond and just kind of hung out there. Didn't, you know, you can argue he was or wasn't because supposedly his wife or mother brought him food, that kind of stuff. But he sat out on Walden Pond and kind of got back to nature and kind of enjoyed himself out there. Also with civil disobedience. So during the U.S.-Mexico War, which Thoreau felt was about slavery, he refused to pay his taxes because he would not pay for a war that he thought was helping slavery. And so he refused to pay his taxes, and then he was arrested for paying his taxes, and he purposely was civil disobedient to the government. He broke the law with a purpose to argue against the taxes being used for this war, which he felt was just trying to expand slavery to the world. So what his transcendentalists wanted to do was give freedom to the slave. They wanted to see that slavery end, and and slavery be a former thing in the United States. They wanted to give well-being to the poor and miserable, meaning that they wanted to make sure that the whole class divide we have wasn't there anymore. They wouldn't have the poor and the rich, and that wasn't necessarily part of our American identity anymore. Learning the ignorant, that everybody had a chance to get learning, not just the rich, and that public schools available to people. Health to the sick, to find that we can make sure medical help and that kind of stuff comes to everybody, not just those who can afford a doctor or afford food, whatever it might be. And lastly, give peace and justice society. The idea that lawlessness and fighting and those kind of things aren't exactly a thing anymore, and are less prevalent in our society at this point. There are critics against this, Nathaniel Hawthorne being a big one, who wrote a book, Scarlet Letter, if you read that, House of Seven Gables as well, very popular books, that basically said that these guys' pursuit of this whole perfect human nature kind of thing was very, this idea of perfect human, this divine human, if you will, this godly type human, was bullcrap, and that, we had to accept the world as an imperfect place and that imperfections exist, and, maybe not, accept them, but, understand that it is part of our culture, and that you have to kind of follow that idea. Our last part of this video will be our utopian communities. So utopian communities were different groups that were trying to lead these perfect societies. So obviously perfection is a kind of a big trend here. You have perfect people with the transcendentalism. Now you have perfect communities with these utopian communities. And you can see where utopian communities try to get started. Different types: Mormon communities, Shaker communities, far-right communities, overnight communities, which will explain those a little more here. The United Community was done by John Humphrey Noyes in New York, 1848. He basically believed that the second coming of Christ already occurred, and so people didn't have to follow these moral rules of religion. And so he kind of created a city where all the people in the city were married to each other and had this carefully regulated system of free love. So basically everyone can sleep with whoever they wanted to within the rules. And so it was kind of a different kind of situation, as most of your American society at this time was pretty prudish in terms of these practices. You have other secular utopian communities as well, who kind of look at two parts here: the demands of community life, the discipline, the hierarchy, in your spontaneity and self-fulfillment, kind of mix those up together. Okay, so it's kind of doing what's better for the community instead of what's being better for you. And so it's supposed to be able to give up stuff and live in peace together. A lot of times they didn't do this. A lot of times they end up still having that social hierarchy and discipline that still came in there, especially between men and women, where they would still do the roles that they were normally quote unquote assigned in society. But it's kind of the big debate going on about this idea of personal stuff versus the demands of a good community. George Ripley, another one who tried starting communities out in New York, out in Massachusetts. Here's Brook Farm, kind of this idea of just what is utopian type communities. Robert Owen was utopian socialist and wanted to say the villages to kind of work together and be one village working towards one goal together. And so this is New Harmony, Indiana. So he kind of had this big plan for it, this big massive wall with this beautiful kind of inside courtyard and stuff. People could live together, work together and stuff. It really looked more like the one on the bottom here. That will happen, right? And he has to see different houses and stuff in labyrinths to try to make this nice perfect community. We're going to stop through this one, ladies and gentlemen. We'll finish up these in the second video. Make sure you guys do your reading on these as well. Can I add some more pieces to it? Thank you for your time.